Jedi News Interview. Mark Newbold interviews Jonathan Rinzler.
It's been about a year since we spoke, actually. It was July last year, so...
Oh, yeah. Time flies.
It really does. It really does. Well, obviously, last time we spoke, you were still working on the making of Star Wars, and you alluded to certain things, but you couldn't really talk about it in any detail. But now it's out and it's selling like hotcakes. We can obviously talk a bit more depth about the book. So, how do you feel about it being such a success? It's been fantastically received.
Yeah, well, it's been great. You know, it was. I think, in a way, we were lucky because it was sort of the one thing that said 30 years.
Yeah.
And of course, there hadn't been a making of before, at least not like ours.
No.
And it's very gratifying because people have really been reading it and liking it, and they really appreciate the fact that it does have a lot of stuff that hasn't been seen before. Precisely.
Yeah.
So it's been great.
Yeah, I mean, how fulfilling was it to be able to sort of go back and concentrate purely on the first film with more detail than anybody's ever had access to? That must have been fantastic to be able to have that sort of access.
Well, I mean, basically, we made the decision to do it archivally.
Yeah.
Before I knew that the lost interviews even existed, because I figured that was the way to go.
Yeah.
Just because 30 years later, who can remember what happened?
Yeah.
And then finding that treasure trove of Lippincott interviews was just great.
You mentioned that in the book. I mean, what you say you went into the archives and they were in a box, but I mean, were they just in a corner under a pile of stuff, or how were they physically found?
Well, what happened was I just asked the librarians at Skywalker if they had any papers related to Lippincott. I didn't even know there were interviews.
Yeah.
Papers or something. And they said that they thought there were, and I'm like, I can't remember how long it was, like a few days or a week later, they said, oh, we found 4 boxes. So they found them.
Yeah. Aren't you amazed that nobody had ever thought to ask before?
Well, I think it just has to do with the fact that for 10 years, basically before that, everybody was really working on the prequels.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, you can't imagine how insanely busy it is.
I can well imagine.
Everybody's kind of overworked, and then before that was Young Indy, and so basically, if you just go back, everybody had other priorities.
Yeah.
So, and I think, like I said, and at least in some interviews, some people out there already had been making a Star Wars book, so there was no reason to look in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. When did you actually start work on the book? Because the prep time must have been quite intensive.
At first I was just doing image work, and I did that. I must have started doing that early in 2006.
Yeah.
Because I knew that would take a long time, and that can be kind of mind-numbing to sort of look through hundreds and hundreds of pictures. So I try and do an hour a day.
Yeah.
And in terms of the writing, I don't know. I'd have to look it up. It was about 2 years to do the whole thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's
less actually. We did it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much detail in there. I mean, I've always enjoyed the behind-the-scenes stuff myself, so that aspect of it was fascinating. But some of the level of detail and just stuff that spins off from the main line of what you would imagine a making of Star Wars book to be, or the peripheral stuff. Stuff I just found fascinating.
Like what?
Well, I mean, just Lucas and the Brat Pack and all the other guys of that era, their camaraderie, and obviously the way they worked together and ran things by each other. And I knew that Lucas was involved with American Zoetrope, and so there was little bits feeding off that, just little peripheral stuff to what you would standardly imagine a making of book would be. Just day 1 we did this, and day 2 we did that. Obviously, there's a lot more to Star Wars than that. I found that absolutely engrossing. So that was my favourite part of the book. Actually, was all the peripheral stuff I found that fed into it. I just thought that was fascinating.
Well, that's great to hear, because I mean that was the goal of the book, was to place it within his, that context. And it's obviously not a biography.
No.
But there were all these other filmmakers who he was hanging out with and who played key parts.
Yeah. I mean, Brian De Palma gave him a hard time, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah, but as George pointed out, he was the only one who actually stayed afterwards.
Yeah.
And helped him rewrite the opening crawl.
Yeah. Well, you need that sometimes, don't you? I think you need somebody to give you a kick up the backside and make you think again, so... But how did you find it, obviously, 2006, 2007, working on the book? How was it to get your head into it not being not 2007, but being 1975? How did you get yourself into that frame of mind whereby you forget Empire and Jedi and the prequels ever happened and it's only Star Wars?
Well, in some ways, it was easy for me because, I lived in Berkeley, which is near Modesto, during the sort of key years. George was in Marin County. I don't know if you know the geography here, but
vaguely,
mainly just across the bay from where I was growing up.
Yeah.
So it's really ingrained in my memory and DNA, or whatever you want to call it, that whole period where American Graffiti came out, and then there was Jaws, and then it was an incredible growing. I happened to be the right age, I was 13, 14.
Yeah.
And all these films were coming out, so it was easy for me to go back and just remember what it was like when the things were coming out, and I knew what it was like to sort of be in that area and what it felt like.
Yeah.
And obviously didn't go into great detail in the book, but it's there on the periphery if you look for it.
Yeah. Looking at that first film and the evolution of the film from Lucas just coming up with the idea to all the battles to getting it made and all the different studios that were involved. Apart from Lucas, obviously, who would you say was the real hero of Star Wars in the way of getting it made?
Well, I think there were several heroes. I think Alan Ladd Jr. comes to mind first, because he was the one who basically got it greenlit at Fox. But of course, you could also argue that if he hadn't greenlit it at that point, Lucas could have taken it somewhere to another studio, which they were prepared to do. I think John Barry comes to mind immediately because, as Lucas describes him in the book, he was a genius.
Yeah.
Who usually doesn't even get mentioned in books about Star Wars because he died.
I know, it's insane, I know. Yeah.
Yes, prematurely. And, he was the one helping Lucas, I think, the most, along with Robert Watts.
Yes.
In England.
Yeah.
And then in America, you had, Richard Edlund and John Dykstra and Joe Johnston, and the whole model shop.
Yeah.
Afterwards, and then Alec Guinness.
Of course.
Because apparently he was sort of the galvanizing. Well, and Harrison Ford. And all four of them.
Yeah.
Mark Hamill. They were, the list sort of goes on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think, ultimately, though, it really does come down to Lucas because, when you're doing that stuff, you always have lots of people sort of pitching in, but it's up to that one person to sort of accept or reject the 100 ideas that all these other people are giving you every day.
And he's the filter for it, isn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, he's the filter for it, and he was the one who, particularly in 74 and 75, if he hadn't really been so gung-ho and spending $400,000 of his own money, which was a huge amount of money back then.
Yeah.
Still is nothing to sneeze at.
No.
It never would have got off the ground.
No. Given that, obviously, people look at the budget now and think, was it 11 million? That it wasn't. It's, they made Star Wars for 11 million, that was peanuts. Even back in 75, 76, that was a sizable budget. Why do you think, apart from the fact that sci-fi apparently wasn't a big hit, is that the only reason why you think people were pessimistic, because sci-fi films generally didn't make money? Or was there more to it than that?
Oh, sure. A, sci-fi movies didn't make money. They never had made money, and B, nobody could understand the script. Even with, you have to remember, Ralph McQuarrie did wonderful paintings, but there were only a dozen of those.
Yeah.
And most people looking at those paintings couldn't imagine how they were going to translate into a movie.
No.
And then there was the nobody could imagine, the end battle such as it was. Because basically their only point of reference was Star Trek and Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
There was just no way anybody could imagine what he had in mind. And even when they did start seeing it, they still looked terrible.
Yeah.
Nobody done sound work like the kind that he was doing with Ben Burtt.
Yeah.
And and Sam Shaw describes it really well. I mean, the technicians working on the film had never taken on a project like that before. So there was just no precedence for all those things, and so there was no reason to think that the film would be different from anything that came before.
There's moments in the book where it's quite clear that certain characters, certain personalities are clashing with each other, and you're quite frank about it in the book. But were there certain... Do you ever come across anything where you thought, well, that's a bit too strong, I can't put that in the book? Or did you pretty much have carte blanche to record it as it was?
Well, I got to know George on a professional level fairly well, during episode 3.
Yeah.
I followed him around for 3 years, and I basically, and Rick and all those guys. And episode 3 of the book is fairly frank as well. And what I learned is that, as long as you're not sort of dishing gossip for the sake of the gossip, as long as you're kind of saying, well, here was A's point of view, and here was B's point of view, and here's where they clash, that basically it was okay.
Yeah.
And so I often said, ooh, I don't know, this is kind of, but, this is what happened. So I put it in the book, and George reads it, and I figured if he didn't like it, he'd take it out.
Yeah.
But I was worried, and when he read it, he came back and said, "Oh, you've written a nice book."
You can't get better than that, can you? Fabuloso.
Yeah, well, he didn't say fabuloso. The word he used was nice, and I said nice. I was kind of thought that it was full of conflict and tension, and and horrible things. And he said, nah. He said, you can take everything that you've mentioned and magnify it by 10, and that's the way it really was.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been the legend of the making of the film, isn't it? All the clashes with the crew and the tension that the British crew put on because of the working hours and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, and like he says, though, there were some people who didn't work out and some people who did, and that's true of any movie.
That's true. Yeah. When he sat down with his agent and they got a lot of the merchandising and sequel rights worked out, that was quite a groundbreaking thing for Hollywood and movies in general. Was there any other things that you found out whilst you were making the book that had happened on Star Wars that just hadn't happened before anywhere else?
Well, somebody starting up their own special effects company.
Yeah.
To use the old term, visual effects now, company to do their movie. I mean, it may have happened, but I'm not, I wouldn't say it's never happened, but certainly that was unusual. I mean, I know Ron Howard even mentions that in his foreword to the Cinema of George Lucas book.
Yeah.
Like, why would you do that? Why take on even more responsibility?
Yeah.
So that was unprecedented. Having somebody start working on the sound, all the unique sounds, even before you have a shooting script, that was unprecedented. I think. Well, I don't know. Those two jump to mind.
Yeah.
But I mean, what you mentioned before, the contract, of course, just a long, drawn-out contract negotiation. That wasn't unprecedented, but they did do it. He had some good people fighting for him. Tom Pollock, yeah. In particular, those guys were pretty tough.
Yeah. Because I guess the fallout of those meetings and those decisions and contracts back in 74, 75 feeds through to probably you and me talking about this book today, I guess, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because he got the sequel rights.
Yeah.
That was the big thing. And, even though they weren't worth anything, it's still the stuff that they usually want to keep a hold of. But somehow they got them. And, I don't think that's happened since then.
No. No.
I'm not an expert, but...
No, that's the reason why I asked, really, because I've never heard of it happening since, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, George Lucas is really the next generation. He's the Disney of that generation.
Yeah.
We haven't done that kind of book, although the Cinema of George Lucas comes close. I mean, but all the work that he did, afterwards with the computer division, and became Pixar and ILM, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
That's unprecedented things.
On the subject of ILM, Lucas has said on more than one occasion, and he mentions it in the book, I think, that he only got a certain percentage of what he saw in his mind's eye onto the screen. So, given that obviously it was massively successful commercially and critically, how different would the film have been? Do you think? I'm asking your opinion now. How different do you think it would have been if he'd have been able to get the whole 100% up there on the screen that he saw in his mind's eye, as opposed to what we, thankfully got back in '77?
Well, I think all you have to do is kind of take a look at the special edition and imagine what, some shots he wouldn't have been able to do no matter what.
Yeah.
As he says, there was just a glass ceiling. He could imagine things, but there was just no way they could do it.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine some of those shots in there that he might have been able to pull off if he had, another 3 months and another, $1 million.
Yeah.
Then that's what you would have got. So you would have, obviously you wanted to have Jabba the Hutt in there. You just didn't have time to get it to a place that where it was working.
Yeah.
And he wanted to have more X-Wings, and he wanted to have a sort of more populated Mos Eisley, and basically all the things he changed.
Yeah.
But in his mind, they weren't changes at all.
No.
That was just the way it should have been.
Yes. Yeah. Given the amount of source material that he had to sit down with sort of 2.5 years ago now when he started, was there much that didn't get in the book?
Well, that was a great thing. They really, Del Rey really came through, because the book was originally going to be about 70 pages shorter.
Yeah.
And I just said, look, here's the manuscript. If you guys can find places to cut things out, let me know.
Yeah.
And there was another editor here who read it, and nobody thought that there were things that should be cut out.
Yeah.
So pretty much it's all in there. And we even got in the expanded universe thing in the hardcover edition.
That's right. I've got the hardcover in front of me, actually, so yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't think... That was a question of whether George would allow us to put it in, but...
Yeah.
I said, sure. What the heck?
Go for it.
Yeah. I think the only thing that it got in that theater, because they thought, well, it's just too weird to have you suddenly come in as a character in the book.
Yeah.
But I was there. I was at a preview at the Coronet.
Really?
Yeah. It wasn't the big preview at North Point, but it was another preview.
Yeah.
And so I just happened to be taken to see that when I was a kid.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Well, final question. Obviously, you've mentioned before that you might look to doing an Empire version, sort of an update of Once Upon a Galaxy. I guess it's fair to assume that there's an equal amount of information out there for Empire.
Well, I mean, there is a book on Empire. That we all agree that book is out there, and it's a great book. Yeah. We wouldn't, if we were to do it, and a lot of people have asked, and we would keep all that text and just sort of fill in the blanks. I can't remember, but because I haven't read it in a while. But,
yeah.
There's probably some pre-production stuff and some post-production.
There is, yeah.
That's missing, and I think there's probably stuff that we can maybe get into more details about. Which other books have already done, but we'll do our version of how the movie went over budget and things like that.
Yeah.
There was quite a bit of drama around that, and then of course for that book, I mean, I don't even want to think about it because it scares me how many pictures and how much artwork. It's kind of daunting. Yeah. First we got to get through Indiana Jones.
That's true. Which is finally happening. Of course, when we spoke last year, you couldn't say anything because it wasn't a definite goer. So.
Yeah, I don't remember, but I don't think I really knew at that point.
No, I don't think anybody did really, did they?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a definite go for years, and then it's not been a definite go.
Yeah.
But now it's a definite go, as everybody knows.
Well, that's it. Then they start shooting in about 6 days.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I can't give you details, but obviously we're going to do some publishing process.
Yeah.
So they'll be coming out in the next few months.
That's fantastic.
Not the books, but the details.
Yeah. Well, I'll be keeping my ears peeled.
Well, fantastic.